All right. Next up, we have instrument-specific articulations. This is a really big one, and if you can notice, I'm kind of going in order of, in my opinion, importance. Okay, because sometimes you might not have an orchestral library that has a lot of CC information for you. That's, it's okay. You can work around with that if you just work with the volume and stuff like that, and try your best to work around that. Ensemble patches are really important and times, especially if you're doing epic stuff. But if you're not doing epic stuff, it's still really helpful, like I said, to help you be able to get things to cut through a mix. Here we have instrument specific articulations. Super important. Use various articulations and extended techniques for an orchestra. This helps to bring more liveliness to the overall music you're creating. In other words, what I'm saying is you can make your track sound more realistic. And I keep using that word again. Remember, my definition of realism is not necessarily something that would be played by concert musicians on a one-pass performance, but something that could be recorded over and over, layered, whatever the case may be, okay? But still be able to be played by live musicians. So an example of instrument-specific articulations is in my cello Divisi 2 and the double basses Divisi 2 patches of this cue. I have Bartok snap pits being used, especially in the final section, starting at like 48 measure. And this adds a necessary tension to the cue, but at the same time, it's just like super realistic too. Now, on the other hand, this is something that would probably more be felt than heard in an actual mix, but I wanted this to also be heard, and so I just went back and just like upped the volume a little bit, okay, and so that way it could also be heard in the track. Here's what that sounds like. You hear that snapping sound? That snapping sound, that's the Bartok snap pits. It's where they literally snap the string of whatever it is that they're playing, the instrument they're playing, as a accent to a normal pizzicato. And then another example of specific articulations being used, you heard earlier in the track when I played it in the woodwinds, the piccolo. I have piccolos almost always using trills. I just love the way it sounds on the Sina winds. So here's what that sounds like here. Okay, there you have it there, and then again here, and then one more time here. So again, using these kinds of articulations just make the music sound so much more real and better, in my opinion. Again, this is just my opinion. Okay, where to learn orchestration techniques and instrument-specific articulations. I would highly suggest and recommend people read The Study of Orchestration by Samuel Adler. I'll definitely pick that up. I'll leave a link to that in the description. This is not sponsored, but I'm just going to leave a link for that for you. And then also, Orchestration Online is a YouTube channel, but he also has an actual website where he has courses that you should buy. He has a book. He has multiple editions at this point now, but he has also multiple books out about orchestration. And Orchestration Online is a YouTube channel where you can find a lot of free resources, but he also has things you could purchase. Great stuff there. Okay. All right, moving on. We have seating chart. Okay, this is really important. Seating chart. A whole video could be made about this, but seating chart basically you could think of as the stereo image for whatever it is you're doing. And then you have to think about also the depth, and then you also have to think about the sonic perspective. Okay, all three of those components together is what gives you a balanced relative loudness for an orchestra. All right, there are times obviously when you're creating inside of a DAW, or even if you're just having things being live recorded, like if you listen to big blockbuster Hollywood films, they're a lot of times hybrid. You can get away with doing certain things that might not be necessarily quote unquote natural or traditional, but still, for the most part, the orchestras sound like the orchestra, right? And so you want to be able to keep these things in mind when you are not a blockbuster film composer, you're an indie film composer, and you're mainly working inside of a box, inside of the DAW, right? So there are traditional and not so traditional seating charts for the orchestra. Traditional seating charts can still be used for media scoring projects. There are times when you may deviate from the norm. For example, let's say you have violin ones and twos on the left or left center. That's more traditional versus having the violin ones strictly left and the violin twos strictly right. That's more modern and film score approach a lot of times. One is not more correct than the other, just a preference and may be determined by the composer and their intentions, but also based on the director and the film and what it is you're working on. So you want to create a realistic or desired stereo image by using panning in your DAW. There are different kinds of panning that you can use. I would suggest finding a chart. For example, I have this one here. You can see it kind of just lets me know like where things are supposed to be placed, again in a traditional sense. So first violin, second violin, you notice where they are, kind of left and then left center-ish. Then you have basically in the center, cellos are on the right, but double basses are also on the right, but just further back because they're louder. Also, what you'll notice is that the louder instruments, the louder an instrument is, the further back in the seating chart they tend to be. But also, that also has to do with what over time composers just emphasize more than others, because that's not always the case. But some things just give a little shine anyway. So let's just move on. So there you have that as far as the like different ways that you can have, you know, orchestral seating. Depth, now, on the other hand, is basically an instrument that has no reverb applied to it will sound very upfront and in your face. And therefore, that will translate to a perceived sound that is closer to you, the listener. Depth essentially relates to the perceived closeness an instrument or sound is to the front of the listener, right? So we're sticking to the stereo image, but this same rule generally applies to the 5.1 and 7.1 mixes as well. So how to get depth into a mix to help with overall realism and synthesization? Well, to do that, to add depth in an instrument or sound, we apply reverb to this instrument. So an example of this is that some VSTs have mic positions which already naturally introduce a room reverb, right? So for example, I have a bassoon here from Cinematic Studio Woodwinds. And if I were to play a line, you might not notice that difference that much because this is not that busy of a track. But let's play this line right here. Right now, I'm just using the standard mix because for this case, I just like the way it sounds better. Let's hear it first with the standard mix. Okay, now let's try hearing what it sounds like if I were to take off the standard mix and maybe use the overheads and the mains. Notice the difference. Let's try the overheads and the room. Not bad. I actually like that quite a bit. Next, let's try the close mic only, which again just means that it's going to be super close to the instrument. And I probably should have taken this off, but I have a reverb already applied to all these, which naturally leads me to my next point, which is that you could also apply reverbs, okay, to your instrument tracks. Okay, now you can either use inserts or you can use sends. Insert versus sends, I will definitely have to hold off on for another video. This whole entire section is going to be another video at some point, but just quickly to put it clearly, I would use reverbs as inserts for instruments that you want to be to feel like they're further back in that seating chart that we talked about, but then I would use sends for entire orchestral families. So you would group them, give them a reverb send. Let's say for brass, give them reverb send. For woodwinds, give them reverb send. For string, give them reverb send. And then also I would give them a global orchestral mix reverb send as well, so that way it kind of tucks everyone in the same room. So there's that. Another thing is, if panning helps the listener identify which direction the sound is coming from, then depth, which is reverb, helps the listener identify how close or far away that sound source is from the listener. Therefore, using a seating chart to help you pan your instrument correctly or as desired, coupling that with proper reverb, like more reverb for trumpets, which are further back on stage than the strings for instruments, can lead to a really convincing mock-up. Next, we have the sonic perspective. This relates to an instrument's perceived dynamic loudness and ability to project over an orchestra, as well as its tonal timbre compared to other instruments of an orchestra. Okay, most orchestral seating is designed to have the loudest instruments further away per orchestral family. This is why double basses are further back usually than the other strings. Woodwinds are closer to the midsection of a stage than the brass. Brass are almost always seated behind all the strings and woodwinds because they have the ability to project their sound much easier and also farther than the others. Finally, we have percussion, and percussion can sometimes be tricky. Like, for example, a glockenspiel most times cannot be heard over an orchestra if the entire orchestra is playing at forte as far as super clear. But the glockenspiel would still be heard and mostly felt because it adds a certain shine quality on top of it. But something like a xylophone can be heard, piano can be heard, depending again on how things work. But again, this is why we have piano concertos, and the pianos are always placed in the front, not just because it's aesthetically pleasing to know that these are the soloists who are working on this track, but also just because it just makes more sense to have the piano who's doing the soloist in the front so that they can be heard more easily compared to the other instruments. So I have an example here where a glockenspiel versus a snare, both instruments have an attack that helps it project over an orchestra, but the dynamic range of a snare is much, much greater than the glockenspiel. So in a mix, this should also be the case. In other words, when you're going ahead and you're in your mixer window, which I'm going to show you mine's right here, right? So if I'm in my mixer window, I'm going to pull that up right here. I should have my volume set in such a way, as well as the panning in such a way to where these things make sense, to where the stereo image is as realistic as I possibly can get it. Again, if that's my desired approach to scoring with the orchestra in a DAW. Okay, moving on. So how to get realistic sonic perspective in a mockup? First of all, you want to utilize either the master volume for the track or insert a utility gain plugin to control each instance onset volume, aka its perceived sonic placement within the orchestral mix. Now, as I just showed you, I don't have these because this is an older template that I have, but in my newer templates, they almost all have a unity gain plugin on them from Kilohertz that just allows me to add gain or reduce gain, I guess volume basically, for each instrument. Another thing you could do is check out the orchestration lecture number 3, Balance by Orchestration Online via YouTube, and he goes much more in depth and detail about the timbral side of sonic perspective and balance. Okay, so that's all I have for today as far as how to use production tips and mixing tips to help your mockups come alive. And I hope you guys found this useful. If you have any questions for me or would like me to elaborate on any point further, definitely just feel free to let me know, and I'll definitely get back to you in the comment section below as soon as I possibly can. All right, y'all, have a wonderful day and happy composing. Peace out.